It's a short life. Grab every opportunity that's available to you. Don't put things off. Get on with it.
From Hamster Wheel Publishing, this is Blunt Dissection. I'm Dave Nichol. Today's guest is the global high priest of veterinary business, John Sheridan. John is one of the profession's true trailblazers, and his journey stretches back to a wartime education during the Blitz, with his early clinical experience back in the halcyon Herriot Era of veterinary practice. He stood at ground zero for veterinary corporatisation in the UK when he set up Veterinary Practice Initiatives back in 1998, and he still reaches into the future and remains on the cutting edge of both thought leadership and content production, publishing his weekly blog and also the Veterinary Business video show, which is currently approaching episode 200. Now, did I mention that in addition to getting his veterinary degree from the RVC, John was president of both the British Small Animal Veterinary Association and the Veterinary Practice Management Association in the UK. He holds a diploma in practice management, the certificate of veterinary practice management, and just because he's showing off, the certificate in veterinary practice administration. John jointly authored the Business of Veterinary Practice book and recently received the Pioneer Professional Member Award from Vet Partners, the only non-US recipient of this award to date, and possibly, to my knowledge, the only recipient ever of this award. So if you're starting to feel a little bit like a sad underachiever, then trust me, you're not the only one in the room. I almost daren't go on to his roll call for speaking credits, which are insanely long, and would take an episode in themselves to list. Suffice to say, John knows his stuff, and people, myself included, over the past 4 decades have been listening intently. John is one of my veterinary heroes and has had a massive influence on my career, so it was a pleasure to have him on as a guest at Blunt Dissection. Hopefully I didn't come across as too much of a fanboy. Anyway, in the episode he gives a masterclass in his forever charming way on how to take risks, network like a pro, push through fear, learn from other people, and how to start up a veterinary hospital, plus why no one wants to be the average client. Plus he practically gives away the blueprint for what the veterinary practice of tomorrow will look like. If that is not a valuable way to spend an hour of your time, I really don't know what is. So, I invite you to sit back and enjoy episode 6 of Blunt Dissection with none other than John Sheridan. Welcome to this next edition of Blunt Dissection. I am sitting in, I would describe it as idyllic, this location. I've got some extremely colourful, are they lupins, John? Is that
Lupins,
what they're?
Yes.
I'm reminded of a Monty Python sketch. An absolute riot of lupins. I don't know if lupins can be a riot. They're probably more orderly than that, but a gorgeous array of pink and purple lupins and a beautiful, I would say, classic English country garden, and what is a beautiful late spring, possibly early summer day. Maybe this is the whole of the English summer we're getting in the last 2 days. And I'm in West Sussex again. I seem to be spending quite a lot of time here recently, but that's not a hardship because it's such a lovely place. I am joined, and I am very, very excited to bring to you today John Sheridan. Now, I'm excited for 2 reasons. One, because I can't think of anybody who's more encyclopedic and aware of everything that's just been happening in the veterinary profession over the last sort of 3 or 4 decades, and really seen through a lot of the changes that we're encountering and ridden alongside it. But the other reason is quite a more selfish reason, and that is John is one of my veterinary heroes. So it's a great privilege to be here and to speak with you, John. So welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Dave. I'm delighted to welcome you to my home, and looking forward very much to a chat.
So I know you, and we've been friends for some time now. But not everybody's in that privileged position. So I suppose the good start point would be maybe can you give us a little background on your journey, where it all started. Let's maybe start with the question every vet gets asked, and that is, did you always want to be a vet, and how did you get into this sort of this profession, and when was that?
Well, no, I didn't always want to be a vet. When I was at school, I I became more. I was clearly a sort of scientist. I mean, I was clearly not a modern languages sort of a person. I was sort of was on the science side, and so biology was the thing that I found interesting. And looking back now, I mean, I'm convinced that whatever you do in life is very much determined by your teachers and by your family. And I just remember at school that my biology master, who was with me for a good many years, Sammy Cole, his name was, he got me really interested. And I can remember one Founders Day, we spent weeks putting together a model of a plastic heart and pipes and circulatory system, and we had red ink and blue ink, and we had, it was great. It was really exciting. So that clearly I was going to be a biologist of some sort. And I can remember when I was in the sixth form, there were 25 of us or thereabouts, and we had a debate one day, and everybody was decided they wanted to be a doctor. And I suppose because I'm always a bit of a rebel at heart, I came to the conclusion that I was going to be different, and I just stood up and said, no, well, actually, I'm going to be a vet. And so that was when I was 16 or 17.
Did you grow up in this area in West Sussex as well?
No, I was a London boy. We lived in South London, and so I was born in 1936. So my earliest memories were of the war and the Blitz and bombing. We had 2 air raid shelters, and I was thinking the other day, as children, I don't ever recall being frightened. I mean, it was just the way it was. Every night, of course, people spent the night in the shelter. But we lived in South London, and then Dad was working in London throughout the war. He had taken over from his father, who had established a theatrical lighting company in London. And his dad died at an early age the year I was born, which was the year that Franklin Roosevelt had won his second election. So he was being inaugurated in the States. In the UK, Edward VIII was on the throne, soon to give up his throne for George VI. And presumably in Berlin or in the Black Forest somewhere, Hitler was planning war. So that was the sort of time. So my early memories were of war. But we did spend quite a lot of time in the country, and so I had in spite of the war, I had a very happy childhood.
Did those experiences, as you were talking there, a question that popped in my head was, in our profession, people fear change. I mean, people fear change generally, but I think us vets tend to fear it a little bit more than others might do. And we're seen as quite a conservative industry, which I think is attractive in some ways. Like the banks like us for that reason, like we're very stable. But in terms of the environment in which we now operate, which seems to be changing at a far more dramatic pace, with technological advances, with changing ownership structures, with changing demographics and their expectations. What's the fact that you were born into what must have been the most turbulent recent period, although that was a very happy part of your childhood? It was quite a disturbing, disruptive and destructive period for Europe and the world generally. Did that shape you, have an impact on your resilience to change or your ability to adapt to change, do you think, over the rest of your career in a way that, and I don't want to paint the younger generation with a brush here, but you do hear of, like, Simon Sinek mentioning the entitlement of the current, the next generation that are coming through seem to be the most entitled generation forever. And the expectation of, well, I'm here, so I deserve it, versus perhaps from wartime, post-wartime, depression times where, well, there's nothing, so you have to make it. Has that been an influence, or first of all, how much of an influence was that on what you did with your career? Because you've done some very interesting things that we will come on to and talk about. And have you ever reflected on the differences between your generation and the current generation of vets that are graduating?
Yes, I have. And strange, I hadn't thought about it much before, but I don't think I've ever really been too apprehensive about change. In fact, in some respects, I've always been looking to change. I've been looking to do the new thing. But I'm very conscious of the fact that my parents' generation had it much tougher than I had. So we're talking about World War One, and for how many families, how many of the young men in the family went off to war and never came back, and so that had profound impact on the sisters. There were large families. My father's family, he was one of 8, and my mum was one of 4 or 5, and I felt very privileged. I was lucky. I went to Dulwich College, which was a public school south of London, and we used to go skiing after Christmas every year for a week before we went back to school. So looking back, that was a very privileged life. So I had it easy and a great childhood, and I enjoyed my childhood, and I didn't really want to leave school. But when I got to the vet college, I thoroughly enjoyed that and didn't want to leave vet college, in a way. But then you move on to the next thing in life, and I do think, and I know, I'm an old crotchety old man, I suppose, but I do think, looking at the younger generation now, for example, I do honestly think that vets in practice, employees in practice, have it cushy compared with some of the practices I've seen. Not so much how it affected me as an individual.
What would be the most dramatic differences between the world that you inhabited and the world that they are?
Well, I graduated in 1960, and I was fortunate. There was no difficulty in getting a job. There were hundreds of jobs in the veterinary record, and I applied for some jobs and went to a number of interviews, and took my first job. My first job was in Norfolk. It was a traditional mixed practice, but it was just the boss and me. And there were lots of small traditional agricultural mixed practices at that time. And so it was great in some ways because there was free accommodation provided. And we got married. I graduated in March, started the job in a week or two after I graduated, and then got married in June, so that my wife and I, we moved into a practice house. But then the routine was, and it was the norm then, we did every other night on duty, full on duty, and I did 2 weekends out of 3 on duty.
And this was mixed practice,
and
or
this
small?
was a mixed practice, and I didn't think anything of it because all of my compatriots at college were all in a similar sort of situation, and so I was quite happy to be on duty. And of course, there were some challenging things, and I mean, it does worry me now that I hear reports from the vet schools that they're not in the business of creating practice-ready vets, which I just think is appalling. I mean, I'm well understand that when you come out of vet college, suddenly having been absorbing information for 5 or more years, suddenly you're in a position where, in theory, you're the expert and ready to answer all the questions. And that's when you start learning. And I can remember my first day seeing stuff that I'd never ever heard of or seen before at vet school, and you bluff your way through it. And you have a boss that you can ask questions for, who was fairly tolerant, and you learn and learn very fast. But I don't think I felt sort of stressed about it at all. It was the norm. And I can remember when we left college, this fear of the Royal College, and you're going to get struck off. At the time, the stories that went round were that in farm animal practice you didn't need to worry too much about it. In small animal practice, the only thing you needed to worry about was embarking on some love affair with a gorgeous client. There were no other sort of reasons why you might got struck off.
Right. It's the big fear, but statistically, it's highly unlikely for a new graduate to get struck off. This is one of the things I learned researching the book I've just written, and it's everyone's huge fear forever. Like when you're going to graduate, and I recall when I graduated, people saying, "Oh, just get through your first 12 months without getting struck off, and you'll be fine." But statistically, you're the most likely year of post-graduation, this was from New South Wales Board of Veterinary Medicine Statistics, I think it was about 8 years post-graduation was the most common time where people actually, and they don't get sued because that's highly unusual, it's a word we use and label, but they have a complaint of some kind that winds up as a disciplinary process through whatever licensing board is there. It's not usually a legal matter outside of the profession. And so it was just interesting that's through the years what we're all terrified of, yes. But it's highly, highly unlikely to happen. Although different reasons now, because one of the things wasn't eloping with a gorgeous client of some kind.
No. No, I learned, from that I learned particularly with when I became self-employed, the relationship that I had then with the registrar, Alistair Porter at the time, was because I had complaints about me, not from clients, but they were always usually from other vets because of advertising or practice plates being too large and those sorts of things. And I had lots of long, gentlemanly, courteous correspondence with the registrar at the time, which I think was no bad thing. I mean, I think it helped me develop as a member of this great profession of ours that I'm proud to have been a member of this profession for a good many years now.
You're alluding to in those conversations with the college, and that's something that today we have to worry a lot less about in terms of, certainly when I first entered a veterinary practice when I was 13 and was asking questions that weren't always medically oriented, and more about the marketing side of things, even then asking about, how do you get clients and things like that, and just getting blank looks back from the principal saying, well, it was a brass plaque on the door and an advert in the Yellow Pages that was fairly low key. That was it. Otherwise you would get you weren't allowed to advertise or compete with fellow practices, which has changed. But surely it's conversations like that, like you were having, and one of my previous guests, Garrett Turley, seemed to be another from Sussex that seemed to be having conversations fairly regularly with the Royal College over marketing practices that surely shaped it for the next generation, and I suppose me and my generation to come along and have it easy in terms of marketing in some ways. So you've described yourself to me before as a bit of a rebel, and that's a side of John Sheridan I'd love to hear a little bit more about and explore, because you clearly have a zest for entrepreneurial activities. And maybe a good place to go in our conversation now, if we can change gear a little bit, would be what's fascinating, what people may not know is that I'm sat in the room with pretty much the germination point for corporate practice within the UK, certainly. Now, John, you may correct me if that's inaccurate and put me right, that's fine. But talk me through your journey from being a vet into practice ownership, and then you then decided to set up Anicare and start building the first, or certainly one of the first, group practices that was truly a corporate, as a sort of gateway into what we now see in the corporate market with 30% corporatisation. Back then, what you were doing must have been seriously got some eyebrows raising and people talking. But talk me through the thought processes for you in going on that journey and making that transition.
Okay, well, I spent just 18 months in the mixed practice, and then I came to the conclusion that was all right in your 20s, but I couldn't see myself grovelling around farrowing sows in the middle of a field miles from anywhere in my 30s and 40s. So I switched to small animal practice and went to a practice in Surrey for 3 years with a view to partnership, but it quickly became clear that it was never going to happen. And this was in the sort of late 60s, and veterinary hospitals were just beginning to happen, and I was aware of the great reputation of Jeff and Christine Startup, who were opening a hospital practice in Worthing. And I remember phoning up Dr. Startup, as I knew him then.
That's a Great name. If you're going to set up a corporate business, that's a fantastic name.
And I introduced myself, and this was totally out of the blue. And I said that I was aiming to have a veterinary hospital one of these days. Would it be okay if I came and talked to him about veterinary hospitals? And he was the most wonderful man. He said instantly he'd be delighted to talk to me, and invited my wife and I to Worthing on a Sunday. We went over there for lunch on a Sunday, and we talked and talked and talked and talked. And I left there sort of 8 o'clock that evening with a job. I mean, I hadn't gone there there wasn't the purpose of the exercise at all. And the job was to run a branch surgery. He and Christine had a hospital in Worthing. It was a new hospital, but they wanted somebody to run the branch, which was Southwick, which was just outside Brighton. So I did, and I became a partner after about a year, I think, and I became a partner. I don't remember any sort of great debate or discussion about values or shared vision at all. It was just the sort of thing that you did. You were invited to become a partner, and you said yes, please, and you paid over your money and became a partner. And at that time, so I worked there as a partner, and at that time, the BVA arranged a week's course on business management at the Henley School of Management.
Nice.
And I can't remember how I got onto this, but I had applied, and Jeff's startup agreed that I should go, and I spent a week there. And so for a week it was a residential. So for a week I was exposed to all of these people who knew nothing about veterinary practice, but knew all about financial management and marketing and production and personnel management and all of that stuff. And I really got into that and was excited about it. Came back to my branch. It was at the time that Beeching was reorganising British Rail and cutting a lot of. So there was the Beeching plan, and I came back and quietly produced a business plan for my end of our practice. So I was running a branch practice in Southwick, just outside Brighton, and I had this vision for Brighton of a central hospital and branches feeding into the hospital, all of that sort of stuff. And I put together a written business plan, and at that time we had 2 other partners who joined the practice, and I presented my plan to my partners. At the time, everybody was madly busy. This is the trouble in veterinary practice. Partners have little time to talk to each other about anything. And regrettably, my plan was never really debated or discussed, and I got increasingly sort of cross about it. And to cut a long story short, I felt angry, and I resigned my partnership. And it was strange, because at the time I was getting sort of lots of tummy aches, and was I getting an ulcer? I have no idea. Anyway, from the day I offered my resignation, I never had another tummy ache from there on. But I had no idea what I was going to do. But then, and a lot happened. I had to give 6 months' notice, and at the end of the 6 months, I bought out my end of the practice. So this was in 1971. So I now was the owner of a single-handed small animal practice.
So you bought the branch surgery.
I bought the branch surgery.
Yeah, right.
And I was ambitious in the sense that I had a vision of where I wanted to go. I didn't want to become the sole principal of a large organisation, because I'd seen a lot of practices, particularly in Norfolk at the time. There were very large, well-known practices with the big boss, with lots of branches. And the problem is that when the boss gets old, you get sort of a bit of a rebellion from the branches, and these practices broke up. So I didn't want that to happen. I didn't really want partners, because I had enough of partnership for the time being. But I could see that there was potential in Brighton for new practices. And I found some premises, rented the premises, set them up as a veterinary practice, put an ad in the veterinary record, and the ad simply said, I'm looking for a colleague to open a new branch. Salary will be 0, but you will have a list of people. You will employ your own staff. We will share nights and weekends. I will help you run the business. And at the time I had some fairly basic management ideas about bookkeeping and so on. And I remember it as clear as anything. Rex Chandler, who was a Cambridge graduate, my age, came and saw me, and we hit it off straight away. He started with a nil salary, but instantly he had a few clients, and we shared nights and weekends, and it was an arrangement which worked extremely well. And so then I bought a branch practice from somebody who had who wanted to sell a branch in Brighton, and then opened up a couple of new practices. And I discovered that what I was really doing was some sort of a franchise. I didn't at the time know anything about franchising, but in return for I provided management support, for which I received a payment which was linked in some way to practice turnover. And it was a very good arrangement in the early days. I joined the British Franchise Association and got involved with people like Pronto-Print and Kentucky Fried Chicken, and talked to all of those people and learned a bit. And then problems arose. And the problems arose because if I was Kentucky Fried Chicken and you wanted to be a Kentucky Fried Chicken franchisee, you would pay me a good deal of money.
Right.
And I would tell you exactly how to fry chicken and what the menu should be. And so you would follow my rules to the letter, because if you didn't, the arrangement would break down and you would go out and the next person would come in. Now, of course, that wasn't the case in vets. I had no control over the way they ran their business. I found it very difficult. We couldn't even agree things like, should we all use the same vaccine or the same fees or the same colour scheme or anything like that, because vets are really nice entrepreneurial people, but they're a cussed lot of people. They like to do their own thing, independent-minded, which is our strength. But then that creates problems. So I couldn't make it work, and I didn't want to break down the friendship, because I had really good friends and colleagues with my franchisees. And so I said, well, we'll change the model now. You can continue to use the name if you want to use the name and pay a fee, but it would be more of a voluntary organisation, because by then I'd got really interested in the business side of practice. There were only two other people that I could think of, and they were Dixon Gunn and John Gripper. As far as we're looking back, they were the only people offering management support and advice. And so I decided that that's what I'd do. I had a little bit of knowledge from Henley. I went over to the States. I went to some AHA meetings and VHMA meetings over there, met various people. I used to go over to the States, learn what I could learn, come back over here and pretend it was knowledge that I'd had for years, and promoted it and talked about it and wrote about it. And gradually, and I spoke at meetings, and gradually people would ask me for advice, and I'd go to a practice and write a report and so on. So gradually I built up a management consulting service. And
had you exited the practices completely at that point? What had happened? Did you sell them to your existing partner / franchisees, or how did that bit wind up?
Well, the plan went wrong really, because this was, by now we're talking about 1984-5, and I had opened a brand new branch in just outside Worthing, the other side of the river, which created some problems with the vets in the other side of the river, who thought. Who fundamentally said to me, we're all tied up here. We've got enough vets in the area. If we have any more vets, it's going to dilute the market. And I argued strongly that if I was wrong, I'd be the one that suffered. They wouldn't suffer at all. Anyway, I set up this branch and found a franchisee, but within a week I knew that she was the wrong person. So quickly we parted company, but it meant then that I had to go back to being a vet all over again, starting from scratch, a one-man band, as a franchisee, at the same time as I was a franchisor and trying to run a management consultancy.
So you got sucked back in to keep that one afloat.
And for a year, I was really, really working very hard until, so it probably deferred things for a year or 18 months.
Right. And what happened next after that?
Well, the next thing that happened was that I was running now a full. So I'd stopped being a vet in 1985-86. I stopped being a vet, and I was a full-time management consultant. And I had a stand at BSAVA Congress every year, and I had built up, I hope, a reasonably good reputation and was fairly well known. I used to go to the States a lot to learn what I could learn. I went to the VMI, the institute at Purdue University, the Joint Institute with AHA. There were 4 modules, and I think there were still 4 modules. I'd used to go over to the States on a Thursday, go to Purdue, work with the group on Friday, Saturday, Sunday, fly back Sunday night and start work on Monday morning. So I did, I think, 4 or 5 modules. And that was a huge education for me, because I met a whole lot of people that I would never otherwise have met, learned a great deal, and was really a full-time sort of management consultant. But the next thing that happened was that it was clear, and by then I was doing quite a lot of practice valuations, and I was valuing practices, and I'd get the practice accounts, and I could see that there were a lot of partnerships when it was John Smith and Mrs. Smith who were the partners. John Smith was the vet and Mrs. Smith wasn't the vet. This was in the late 80s, early 90s. It was clear then that there were already practices who were in effect part owned by non-vets. So when I used to go to the States and I could see what was happening with corporate practice in the States, met up with 2 people, with Peter Beaumont in the States, who was a British vet, and with a couple of other people, and we agreed that we would put together a business plan for a corporate practice in the UK. Although at the time, it strictly speaking wouldn't have been allowed by the Royal College. We put together a business plan, which I thought was a pretty good business plan. It was about 1 centimetre thick, I remember. And it was becoming clearer and clearer. So by now, I suppose we were in up to the sort of 94, 95. It was becoming clear that the Royal College were less sure about their position. I mean, I don't think there was any sort of dramatic decision making. It just happened slowly but surely. The Royal College started to recognise that other people could own a veterinary practice as long as nothing interfered with the ethical relationship between a vet and a client and the Royal College. That was the ethical relationship which had to be maintained. And so we did a deal with a large firm of international accountants who agreed to create a better business plan, the business plan that we would need to raise money at no charge, but in return to a fairly substantial sum when we raised the money. And so I can remember one winter spending great deal of time in the City of London, going around talking to all sorts of people. And I was, a total amateur at this. It was an absolute, total new world to me. But the other members of the team were more au fait with that world than I was. Looking back, we spent a great deal of time trying to raise the money. And we did raise the money, but we didn't raise as much money. I can't remember the numbers, but I think we were looking for 8 million, and we around 3.5 million, or something, those sorts of numbers. And we started buying practices. And looking back, why did it go wrong? It went wrong, I think, because we spent more time on raising the money and not enough time on saying, so what do you do when you suddenly discover that you own 4 or 5 practices around the country? What practically do you do? How do you manage practice from afar? Those sorts of issues. But in 1996-7, we started buying practices, and we bought, I think, a total of 36 or 37 practice units. I switched from being a self-employed chap. I stopped being a vet. I gave up my consultancy. I became an employee of the company, of Veterinary Practice Initiatives, until I retired as an executive director. I was chief veterinary officer for the company in 2003, but remained on the board until 2005. So I was a non-executive director then for a couple of years, and VPI went wrong. and it went wrong for a number of reasons looking back. But I think fundamentally our problem was we ran out of cash. You know, I'd already been talking about businesses failing because they ran out of cash more than because they were unprofitable, and that's exactly what happened with us. And, you know, it's history now, but VPI was taken over by CVS, and the practices that we had then are, as far as I'm aware, very successful members of the CVS empire.
So much to go into. Fascinating to sort of hear that. I was speaking about money. One of my first questions was access to money, I mean, I'm talking when you first bought into the partnership, did you have to approach a bank at that point? Or was it, what did the deal look like in that time period to buy into a practice?
To buy into the practice back in
late 60s. Yeah.
And we had gone to see a practice to buy, knowing nothing about the finances of the practice, knowing nothing about the value of the practice or anything like that. But I remember going to see this practice, and this was a wonderful man. I mean, I'm sure he's dead many years ago. He'd had cancer of the throat, and he'd had his larynx removed, and so he spoke with difficulty, you know, through a laryngeal stoma, I suppose. Yeah. But the standard of practice in those days, in this practice, which was a well-known practice, cat spays were taken in, spayed today, had an abdominal bandage and hospitalised for a week, and then the bandage was taken off and they went home a week later. Looking back at his dispensary, there was nothing in his dispensary except there were different colour aspirins, and he had little brown heart and tonic tablets, and you know the standard of medicine was just awful. And
was the body bandage on there because there were no ligatures applied? You hear of
the straight answer is I don't know. It's just I have this sort of vague memory of, and because of ill health, and he didn't drive, this vet, and if you phoned him up and wanted a house call, he would ask you which was the best bus to get and how far you'd had to walk from the. It was that sort of a.
Not quite ambulatory.
So it opened my eyes to the state of this particular practice, and in fact there were lots at that time. There were lots and lots of practices like that. I know because I saw a lot when I started providing a consultancy service. At the startups, I don't remember a great deal of debate. It was partly financed by Bank of Dad and partly financed by bank loans. The bank was very happy to provide the loan. I don't ever remember putting together a business plan. It was just a word. I'm sure the loan was secured, perhaps by my dad. A reputation of my senior partners. And that was enough to raise them, so that the money wasn't an issue, and I was able. I mean, I can't remember what I was earning then, but I was able to pay back the loan without any great difficulty.
From that journey through your formation of the corporate model, and just your journey through life as a veterinarian, what are the top sort of maybe 2 or 3 lessons that you've taken away? You think, if I do it again, I'd do it this way. Or perhaps we really did that bit well. That would still stand up today. Does anything jump out to you when asked that question?
I believe in practice. I'm a firm believer in practice. How well you do in a career in veterinary practice as a veterinarian, as a professional, depends very much on your first boss. My first boss he had no business sense at all. He was a wonderful vet in the old-fashioned sense. The way he related to his clients, communicated with his clients, his reputation for honesty, for reliability. If he said he was going to do something, he did it, was just wonderful. And the way he allowed me to do stuff. I mean, in my first week, I went to see a heifer that was calving. I knew I wasn't going to be able to carve this heifer. I could feel 3 feet. I told the farmer that we would have to do a Caesar, and the farmer said, absolutely, that's fine. I phoned up my boss and said, boss, we're going to have to do a Caesar. What time shall I tell the farmer that you'll be along? Oh, golly, he said he was off to Fakenham races that day, so I better go home and boil the stuff up and get on and do it. So I did that. I boiled all the stuff up in a fish kettle that we used to do to boil the instruments, went back to this heifer, did a Caesar, delivered a dead calf. Was it a schistosome? It was where the abdominal wall didn't fuse. So the calf was dead. The heifer was fine, stitched her up. I went back to see this heifer every day for 10 days until I took the stitches out. I don't think any heifer had such care in terms of to go back every day. So from a financial point of view, it must have been a total disaster from the practice's point of view. But it taught me so much about all sorts of things. So my boss was like that. He would allow me to do tons and learn. And there were lots of failures and some successes, but golly, you learn. So that's that. Then the other bit of your question you asked about what I do now is that if I was a young vet now, I would definitely look for a career in practice. Probably not as a clinician. You know, if you invited me if you had a practice and you invited me to do evening surgery, I'd be all right with the customers, the clients, be all right handling the animals. I'd be totally lost in the pharmacy, totally lost with diagnostics. So the lesson I've learned is that whatever your ambitions, whatever your aspirations in life are, whether it's to do with animal welfare or a good working environment, or work-life balance, or better medicine, or develop a specialty as skins or orthopedics, or you wanted time off to play golf 3 days a week, whatever it is, every one of those depends on owning or managing an efficient, effective, economical business which has to make a healthy profit. And I wasn't aware of the imperative for profit until too late in my career.
So that's an interesting direction to take the conversation, and I couldn't agree more with you. I mentioned earlier fear of change, and fear in general it seems to be something that... Well, I was speaking at a conference this weekend, and on the Sunday there was a panel where I was invited to sit, and the topic was, corporate versus independent practice, should we fear this? Why is everybody so scared? And one of the questions came back from the floor was, well, look, practices are too expensive to buy into now. We can't get a foot in the ladder. If the corporates come in and they buy 3 practices in a town, I don't have any options. And I was sort of curious about that. I challenged that back a little bit, because corporates don't want every practice in the UK or America or Australia. They only want a certain above a certain size and above a certain revenue. And that's what makes sense for them to work. And certainly in the US, they don't want 1 or 2 vet practices. They want 4 or 5 doctor hospitals that are run effectively, that can just add growth to them and add profit right away. And there's a plethora of 1 or 2 vet practices that are not very well run, that still have bosses who don't really appreciate the need to deliver profit, and are perhaps sitting on a practice thinking they're going to get a big payday, and are possibly going to get a big shock when that payday doesn't come along. So my question for you is, given that as a backdrop, what would your advice to a young vet who was starting out their career be in terms of getting into ownership? What direction, what things should they be doing? How can they fund it? What are the avenues into that career path? How do they go about it?
Well, when I was consulting, I always took the view that if you did your homework, there were the chances are there was always room for a new vet in an area, and the very best place to set up would be bang next door to a super duper hospital, because super duper hospitals attract the people who are looking for super duper hospitals. But there will always be people who want to seek professional advice from a named individual or a couple of named individuals, where it's a much more personal thing. And the issue, I think, really is that traditionally veterinary practices have worked on the basis that we have to be all things to all men. we have to, on the one hand, provide a service, an expensive, very special service for people who are looking for high-priced, very special stuff. But we also have to look after the interests of the people who are very cost-conscious, who are looking for the services offered by sort of a high-volume, low-price service, and that you end up with this graph. And so, if you were to ask the people who worked in the practice, who have we got to look after in this town, they would all say we want to be looking after all the people all the time. And so if you asked a practice where was their niche in this on this graph, they would say, well, somewhere in the middle. We like to provide a good standard of service at a realistic, fair price, whatever that is, to a fair number of people. And the trouble is that clients now don't want to be average. Who wants to be average? I either want to be the client who I can afford it and I'm looking for the best, but by George, I demand the best and happy to pay for it, or I'm very cost conscious, so money is an issue for me, but I still want the best possible service, and I want all the reliability and honesty and all those other attributes. And so I think increasingly it's a question of selecting, and I'm not a marketing man, but isn't this what marketing people say? You've got to pick a niche, you've got to find your little bit. You asked me if I would be, or I had assumed you'd ask me, did I want to be a vet again? Yes, I would want to be a vet again. I would want to be a practice owner. I don't think I want to be a clinician again because I've sort of done that. But I would pick a niche, and it might even be, I'm only concerned with people who own Cavalier King Charles Spaniels that have congestive heart failure. I mean, it might be a tiny little niche like that. Although I must say now, I'm even more excited about the future of my profession in practice, because I was fortunate, I went to Las Vegas in February, and at a meeting of vet partners, and the whole debate for 2 days was all about the Internet of Things and about telemedicine and IT and all of that sort of stuff. And coming back, I thought to myself, if I now wanted to be involved in starting a practice all over again, I would look at it completely from a client's point of view. In a way, Maureen and I, we've had Irish setters all our lives, always had 2 Irish setters. And when one dies, we'd always get 2 new puppies. And we lost our last Irish setter about 3 or 4 years ago, so we now have a rescue dog. So I, in a way, I'm in a situation, I'm not a vet, I have to pay for veterinary, or I have to insure for Bess. She's the love of our life, apart from our children and grandchildren. So if I was a pet owner now, looking for a vet, in an ideal world, I ask myself what would I be looking for, and I have this vision. I could tell you what it is that I'd be looking for. So if I was a young vet, that's what I'd try and provide, and that would be very different from almost any veterinary practice that I see now. So I think the future of the independent sector is great. But the picture of what the model would look like is going to be very different from what it is now. And that raises a whole lot of questions about regulatory questions, all the stuff that the Royal College is on about. But the future of what actually happens over the next 20 or 30 years won't be determined by the Royal College of Veterinary Surgeons. It will be determined by the marketplace, by the entrepreneurs, by the providers of the services demanded by the customers.
So what are the big questions then? Are any of them on the tip of your tongue?
If I was a pet owner, I mean, the questions sort of come later, really. And I have to say I'm a little bit disappointed because I'm a member of SPIV, yes, the SPIV discussion group. And when the Royal College announced that they were conducting this survey, and I'm absolutely sure that it was the right thing to do. They had to do this because they have to know what the profession is thinking about. And I do get the impression from talking to vets and monitoring those discussion groups that it's all a bit negative. We're very defensive. As a profession, we're conservative. We don't want the change, and we so defend to the hilt. And it still happens now with veterinary nurses.
Yeah,
doesn't it? I mean, I can recall when I was climbing the presidential ladder and BSAVA. Great debate about RANAs, as they were then, registered animal nursing auxiliaries, and the debate about nurses and what could nurses do. And I think the frustration caused by some, in the minds of many nurses, is because vets want to hang on to what it is they're doing. Nobody can do an intravenous, take blood as quickly and as efficiently as I can.
There's the trap of
we think we're special. We're good at everything as veterinarians.
Right.
In a way, I mean, I'm aware now that it's difficult for vets to find qualified nurses, because qualified nurses come into the profession wildly enthusiastic, and then they seem to go off and have babies and families and so on, and don't come back into the profession. And not that I know, I'm an old man of the wrong gender, but I think the frustration is that their skills and expertise aren't used by their employers. And in a way, so that's our fault. It's the fault of my profession, and so I'm anxious too that my colleagues in the profession, in practice, are very defensive about the changes that I think are coming, and I think we'll miss out, because I think a corporate, if I as an individual am beginning to have a vision of a veterinary practice in 5 or 10 years' time, which uses much more high IT and high tech and all of that sort of stuff. If I'm thinking about that, you can bet your bottom dollar that the corporates are thinking that way too, or at least some of the corporates or some groups within the corporates are thinking that way. And if they're thinking that way, they could do it quicker and faster than I could as an individual. So I think the strengths of the independent practices are that they can make decisions quickly, they can raise money quickly, they can go to the bank, they can put together a business plan quickly. They don't have to persuade an awful lot of people. They can just start doing it.
How does an independent practice, I agree with you, the cost of the projects that are in the pipeline? Let me backtrack. I think there's a danger that vets become obsolete to a certain extent. And I'm just going to throw this theory at you and see what bounces off. But and when I say obsolete, I actually mean invisible, because there's a conversation happening outside of veterinary practices regarding animal health care, and we have a diminishing volume in that conversation, principally because we are still not embracing the technologies that we really can't even describe as new technologies now, but technologies of communication in ways that allow us to communicate more frequently with pet owners at less expense and continue to have impact. Once upon a time, for a pet owner to get information, they would come in a veterinary hospital. Then they would have found a pet magazine, perhaps. Fast forward, evolution of internet. Now there's websites galore and there's social media, and just the ability to connect to whatever interest you have. You can now find somebody who's willing to feed you some form of news. And as we know, the internet's full of really good quality news that's completely, trustworthy. But what we do know is that doesn't matter whether it's trustworthy or not. People are listening and consuming that news and believing it to be fact. And where you and I had to go to veterinary college for 5 years to become qualified, a piece of advice on the internet simply needs 3 people to click the like button and it becomes a qualified source, with value that changes behavior. And my concern is we are still not getting into that part of the conversation. So when you start having conversations with practice owners about big data and how to generate, what data is useful to us and how we generate that data, and then how we process that and how we then influence the medical decisions and actually the conversations and the alerts, the way we get practice owners to interact with us, it's just a blank look back that you get. That's exciting to some, but just it's too big a change from, well, people walk in my exam room and I fix their pet, this reactive medicine that we've practiced. It's too big a leap. And actually the expense involved in we've built apps. Like apps are expensive things to do right. You can do it cheaply and they're not brilliant. But the investment required to fund the development of a device that measures the amount that an animal will move around every day, or the accelerometers that are in our phones to shrink those down to a size where they're actually not unwieldy, horrible things that chew up enormous amounts of battery life. That's an expensive undertaking. And I think corporates are the only ones that are likely to have the pockets for that. And pharma, I think, is likely to develop that and then bring it to practices rather than groups of practices. But in your opinion, how does the independent practice, or indeed the corporate practices? I'm really not here to bash corporate practice or to encourage you to do that, which would be a daft thing. But how do we best harness these and bring these into practice in a meaningful way that are of benefit to everybody?
I think one of the people that I spoke to at this conference in the States was telling me about lameness in horses. Now, it's a long time since I saw a horse, but he was telling me, because I can remember at college and afterwards, you go and you trot a horse up because it was lame, and then there would be a great debate. How do you decide which limb and whereabouts and which limb it was? And he was telling me now about the high-tech equipment. So you put some little sensor on the horse's head, and some little sensor on two of its limbs, and where or how, I have no idea. And you have a wireless receiver, and you trot the horse up and down for 10 minutes, and you get a printout from this receiver which will tell you exactly how much weight is being borne by each limb in turn, and in effect it tells you which limb the horse is lame on, and even which part of which limb. So there, you don't need a vet to do that. You just need a technician who knows where to attach these things. And then, presumably, a vet or somebody has to understand the report. So that I'm really going back to, as a pet owner, here am I as a pet owner. I bought a new puppy, and I know that it's got to be vaccinated, and I know I've got to talk about its diet and worming and all that sort of stuff. So how would I go about it? Well, I'd like to be able to go online, look at my local veterinary practice, and read some stuff to start with. And then if I have questions, I'd like to be able to talk to somebody who begin to advise me about what needed to be done. And in an ideal world, I would want somebody to pop up here and give the vaccines, or I'm happy to go down there. If there was a problem, could see if I do a deal with the vet, and the deal would be that I would pay on a monthly or quarterly basis, and I would be provided with some stuff. I want to be provided with a smart collar so that my dog would be constantly... I don't know how these things work, but I know that you can record pulse and heart rate and blood oxygen and respiration rate, all those sort of temperature and all those sort of things. If it had a lesion, I'd quite like to be able to have a little gadget that I could look over my dog at the lesion so the vet could have a look at it. And I'd be happy to use any other bits of gear that the vet might give me so that they could do blood glucose or whatever it may be. If it was decided that I needed a professional to see the dog, depending on my circumstances, I'd like to be able to say, what time will you be up and have a look at Charlie? And if Charlie had to go in, or if Bess had to go in for some operation or procedure, I'd like to be able for somebody to pick it up, or I'd be able to take it. That is, I'd want to embrace better communication, better IT, and I don't know all the. I was just amazed. I know now, this internet of stuff that fridges, televisions, hoovers, almost anything in the house is computerized, isn't it? It's connected with other things,
That's right.
Smart meters and all that.
Skynet is alive and well.
Yeah. So that's a world which is totally beyond me as an individual, but I'm aware that it's happening,
yes.
And I could be excited about its impact on my profession. So that, as you say, the role of the vet is likely to be a very different specialist bit of that service, and the nursing bit a specialist bit of that service. But the technical expertise, we've got to embrace that technically. But I do understand that will raise regulatory issues for the Royal College, but they will be raised and discussed and determined and it will happen. And as always, the regulatory bodies in this country and around the world will adapt what their attitude to what's happening in the marketplace. It happened with advertising. It happened with, particularly with advertising, and particularly with discussion about fees and all of those things. All of those things have happened, and 2 or 3 years later, the Guide to Professional Conduct is adapted to take account of what's happened in the marketplace already.
It's a fascinating overview. So let's change pace, and we always wind up an interview with some of the more rapid fire questions. So, John, over the course of your career, are there any habits or routines that you've gotten into that have helped you build success? And I'll chuck in a part 2 of that question, and that is, no one in any career goes through it. Nobody ever achieves any success without having significant and meaningful failures along the way as well. And so, are there any habits or routines that helped you overcome those moments in your career? And probably heavy drinking isn't a good answer at this point.
No,
Okay.
not for me. Although I used to smoke a lot. I used to smoke very heavily. In fact, I used to smoke. But I'd have a cigarette between each consultation. I'd light a new cigarette and put it out. Anyway, that's sort of history. So I haven't smoked for 30 or 40 years. Habits. No, I can remember a long time ago thinking to myself, why is it that sometimes I can wake up in the morning and feel absolutely on top of the world, fine. And other days I can wake up in the morning and the circumstances haven't changed and I feel down or crotchety or something. And I came to the conclusion it's because there's a danger that my attitude in life depends on the attitude of other people. So the conclusion I came to was that I would try never to let other people's attitudes influence me, that it was all up here. It's always all up here, and it was down to me, and I've tried to follow that, and I've always tried to. I suppose I'm a half full,
right,
a glass half full man.
And did you do anything to cultivate that when you had the observation and the self-awareness moment? Did you do anything to try to cultivate positivity?
No, I don't think so. I suppose the only habit that I've got into is that if I have jobs to do. And we've all got jobs to do. I try and I'm working at it always to do the tough ones first. Get that stuff out of the way so that the exciting stuff I can move on to. So I suppose I'm fortunate to be an optimist. And I can tell you how not. I mean, I've had lots of failures. I can tell you how not to franchise. I can tell you how not to start a corporate. I can tell you that running a business successfully. You have to look at the big picture. You have to be excited about the big picture. But what makes a business successful is the little stuff. The phone has to be answered now. That letter has to be answered now. It's the little stuff. And it's the same with, you mentioned a lot of independent veterinary practices that aren't performing financially as well as their owners would hope, and therefore aren't as valuable as their owners would hope. And the secret, I'm sure, is that because and this is old stuff, because we fundamentally run fixed cost businesses, is to think, looking at the big stuff, think bold. But when you want to do it, think small and tiny. I've said to people, if your big objective is to double your profit next year, the way to do it is to do 2 or 3 little things, but to do them absolutely right. And because we're a fixed cost business, it's easy to do that. It's not difficult to make a practice earning 10% margin to a practice earning 20% margin. You don't have to spend a great deal of money. You don't have to double your fees. You don't have to employ more staff or pay them more. You just do the little things right and properly. And if I could add one last thing, I've always believed in my consultancy role is that whatever's going right or wrong in a practice, anywhere in the practice, it'll show up in the numbers somewhere. So I'm a sort of a numbers man. I like when I was in my consultancy role, I always wanted to look at the numbers, not just the published financial accounts, but management accounts and some other numbers. Because I'd know then, if I looked at some numbers, I'd have a good feel about fundamentally where are the problems that needed to be addressed in this practice.
Were there, that naturally leads into a separate question, which maybe isn't a short form question, but are there I love the 80-20 rule, and you pull the little lever and you get a big change. Was there a common 2 or 3 things that you saw in every practice where that's always the problem from the numbers?
I think the big problem is that the veterinary don't really understand what's really going on in their practice. If you were to ask a vet how well does he know his practice, they would give themselves a score of 7 or 8 or 9 out of 10, I suppose, because they know the good clients and the bad clients. They know the strengths and weaknesses of their staff. But if you ask them simple management numbers like, how many phone calls did you get yesterday? How many were converted to an appointment? What was the occupancy of your consulting room? I mean, those simple sort of stuff that any manager in any sort of a business will know. Vets don't know that. And they don't know it, I think, partly because now every practice is computerized, so you have masses and masses of data, but not enough information.
Right.
It's they have to determine what information do I really need in order to make the decisions that I can only I can make because I'm the owner of this practice. So they get their accounts from the accountant, and they tell me that they get management accounts from the accountant. Accountants shouldn't be creating management accounts. Accountants should advise, by all means, but it's the practice owner or manager should decide what numbers have I got to look at every Monday, once a month, once a quarter. One of the big lessons I learned when I went to Henley School of Management back in 1960, whenever it was, there were about 20 of us, I seem to recall. One of our numbers was Peter Story Pugh. Now, I don't know if you know, Peter Story Pugh was a very well-known member of our profession. He was president of the Royal College, president of the BVA. He was a prisoner in Colditz in the war and escaped from Colditz. He was a great man. He told us that at the time he was a lecturer in Cambridge, at the Cambridge School, and he owned a pig farm, a big pig enterprise, and he told us about management by exception. And what he told us was that he had a list of KPIs, key performance indicators, about pig farms. And every Monday he would meet his manager at 8 o'clock on a Monday morning, and he would have this report in front of him. He wasn't in the least interested in all of the things that were going right. They were on track compared with budget. He was only interested in the 3 or 4 or 5 things that were going off key. So he would spend an hour talking with his manager. Why is this number off key? The manager would tell him why he thought it was. What are we going to do about it? Yes or no? What decision do we make? This number is going wrong. What are we going to do about it? Why is it happening? So in an hour, this was management by exception. He would make some decisions that needed to be made. He'd delegate authority to his manager to get on with it and do it till the next Monday. And that's the way we ought to be running our veterinary practices, to allow clinicians, if they want to be clinicians, to practice or not practice just as they want to, but not to be tied up with with drawing graphs and building up numbers. They want to employ somebody within the practice to provide them with the numbers that they need to make the decisions that only they can make as practice owners.
Sage advice. And on advice, so I'm conscious we're pushing time, and it's lunch is almost upon us. Very quickly, what's the best piece of advice you ever received or gave? And the worst piece of advice you ever received or gave?
Best piece of advice was from my dad, who said to me once, "You're a long time dead. Nobody ever gets to the end of their life and regrets. What they regret is what they didn't do. They regret." So the lesson was, it's a short life, happy one. Grab every opportunity that's available to you. Don't put things or get on with it. Worst bit of advice, I think, in veterinary practice was, the only way to improve your profitability is to control the costs. If by controlling the costs it means cutting down on the costs, that can be bad advice. Controlling the costs in the sense of understanding the costs is good advice, but it's much easier to build the top line.
Brilliant. John, I could talk to you for hours and hours, and unfortunately for you don't live too far away from me, so that's not impossible. Thank you very, very much. That was an absolute pleasure and delight. Where can people learn more from you or catch you online, and to find out more about what you're doing? I know that you publish a lot of content, and we haven't even gotten into talking about the Veterinary Business Video Show, which is on show number 193, which has been going for like 7 years. And you publish, monthly digests of all great stuff from around the on the web concerning veterinary medicine, and you blog, and really you put me to shame. So where can people catch some of this, and where can we give John Sheridan a bit of love?
Well, that's kind of you. I mean, I run a membership website. It's veterinarybusiness.org, veterarybusiness, all one word, .org. And always happy to receive, not very good on phone calls because I sort of pop in and out and I'm involved with other things. I've just qualified as a first responder and I play the saxophone, so I do other things apart from that. But always happy to receive emails, john.sher@btconnect.com.
Perfect. John, thank you very much for being on the podcast. Great fun speaking to you.
Thank you very much.
Hey folks, just me again. Thanks very much for listening. Now, if you enjoyed this show, can I ask you to do me 3 little favors? The first one is subscribe on iTunes so you get automatic notifications whenever I produce a new episode. And while you're there, don't forget to leave a 5-star review and some nice comments. I do read them all and they're very encouraging. And the final thing is follow me on Facebook at facebook.com/Dr. Dave Nichol, where I post a weekly blog for anybody in a leadership position in veterinary practice. Thanks for listening in, and until next time, look after those pets. Don't forget to look after yourselves too. Till next time on Blunt Dissection, have a great month.